dear members of the SOS group, organizers of this event tonight, and also a special mention to the Noise Association and the Noisers, who are great students and who really do contribute to social entrepreneurship. It's a very big message of welcome to you in this business school, ESCP Europe, which maybe, as you may know, is the world's oldest business school. And it was created in 1819, which is a historical fact, by economists, and especially by Jean-Baptiste Say and Vital Roux. And what these guys had in mind, back to 1819, was the education of leaders so that they would do business fairly. And that wealth should not be deriving from speculation. It's good to see that this notion of justice, good justice, referring to one of your chapters, was meant for future leaders being taught management and business so that it would be affordable to all who had merit and not just to those who could afford it financially. So we're very honored to have you tonight, and you're in ESCP Europe, and you are a great European. A lot of your studies have been covering the board of countries across Europe. I have read it in English, which is of course my native language, but still, in French it's called la grande fracture, which has slightly medical connotation to it, like the hip fracture. But at least, when it is the big divide in English, it's almost geographical and topological, and it cannot be mended. But regarding medical matters, you never know, and it's a big message of hope. So we are very honored to have you tonight, and I would like, of course, to again applaud Professor Stiglitz, a great doctor, also of business, a great professor, and a wonderful Nobel Prize winner. Welcome. One of our former alumni of ESCP Europe, a big organizer, is going to address your audience.
Hello everyone. Everything okay?
Yes.
You're at home? Nice summer?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for this event that is maybe one of the first time I was so happy to get back to school after summer. So this event is possible here thanks to an association called NICE, which is really an association I have in my heart. And it is organized by 300 students all over France in 6 universities. It has been created 4 years ago because students wanted to take the action to their education. They realized that they were seated in classes for hours, just listening some stuff about maybe kind of the old world, and they wanted to be active while they were studying. And especially in the top universities where business school, political science, and all kind of grande école we have in France, they realized that we would have the possibility to have a huge power on society, and they wanted to use it in the right way, but they didn't know how to do that. So I can tell you that for this conference, when I asked on Facebook, we have a group on Facebook to say like, would you like to invite Mr. Stiglitz at ESCP on the 31st of August? I had like hundreds of comments saying, yes, 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 I'll be there, I will come back from my summer holidays with my grandparents, and then I'll be there. So thank you very much. I know there are so many students here, and also in other outside that they wanted to come, but they couldn't because there was a waiting list, whatever, that are really curious about everything you can tell them. So what can they do? They have the energy, they have the will, they have the love. They want to do stuff in a different way. They will maybe become politicians, bankers, artists, and they're ready for it, and they're waiting for what you can share to us. So thank you very much for at conference and Groupe SOS to make this possible with us, and so now I give you the stage. Thank you.
Merci, thank you. Petit mot en français d'abord pour remercier les partenaires de votre conférence, pour pas qu'ils se moquent de la façon dont je vais prononcer le nom de leur entreprise. Un grand merci parce que cette conférence n'existerait pas sans Accenture, Suez Environnement, le Crédit Coopératif, Danone Communities. Et puis exceptionnellement pour cette conférence, évidemment, le ESCP et le Noise. Un grand merci pour l'accueil. Et puis la maison d'édition aussi, Les Liens qui libèrent, sans qui cet événement n'aurait pas existé aussi. Merci aussi à la ville de Paris qui accueille cet événement, avec qui on retravaille sur le partenariat avec les Hub Conférences. Et puis la ville de Sceaux aussi, avec qui on va faire pas mal de choses dans les mois qui viennent. So, the conference language is English, so let's go. We are very happy, proud and grateful to welcome you, Professor Stiglitz. Let me shortly tell me why. First of all, as you know, we love Americans in France, especially ever since they have recently become trend heroes. It's best to love. More seriously, we are proud because it is the first time we have the opportunity to welcome a Nobel Prize winning economist, and we have already had a Nobel Peace Prize, Professor Yunus. But you are our first Nobel Prize winning economist. However, and this needs to be enhanced, not all Nobel Prizes in economics are welcome here. Every week, during the Hub conferences in which you are about to take part, we promote social innovation and social aspects as equal opportunities, a fair distribution of income, or closing the gap between the rich and the poor. Your fight against social inequalities is famous all around the world, and you said, I quote, that the only true and sustainable prosperity is shared prosperity. The economy must serve social justice. You are a Nobel laureate in economics for peace. We strongly share your opinions. The conferences are powered by Groupe SOS, which is one of the biggest and foremost social enterprise in Europe. For more than 30 years now, Groupe SOS has been putting economic efficiency at the service of the interests of general public. In so doing, it provides responses to the issues of today's society by developing innovative solutions in its 5 main fields of activity: education, healthcare, housing, employment, elderly. More than 1 million people are impacted by the activities of the Groupe SOS every year. No matter their origins or income, all of them are entitled to the best care which can be provided. So, Professor Stiglitz, you are at home here, and we are honored by your presence. Thank you very much. I talk to Christine Quentin. Christine, c'est la première fois qu'on fait le passage de rôle en anglais. Who is going to lead the debate. Always a pleasure. Thanks, Christine, and have a good conference. À bientôt tout le monde. Bye, everybody.
So indeed, it's the very first time we're doing the Hub conference in English with no translation. So I'm very happy and stressed a little bit, I must say, but it's going to be okay. I'm not going to be the one speaking tonight. So just to give you some few words about how it's going to happen tonight, we're going to have a 40 minutes interview together, Joseph Stiglitz and I. And then 3 students from the Noise are going to join us to ask their own questions as well. And there will be no question and ask row during that time, but you can participate on #HubConf. Am I correct? So this time I did not forget. #HubConf if you want to share your point of view, ideas, words, and once this moment will be done, you will have all of you, each one of us actually, will have the privilege to benefit from a 40 minutes or 30 minutes, because we're kind of late, signing session with Joseph Stiglitz. Over here, you have the opportunity to buy his book. I show it, I do my job properly. La grande fracture, au lien qui libère, voilà, qui est juste à l'entrée. You have the opportunity to buy it and to have it signed by Joseph Stiglitz. Just so you know, you will be the very first one in France being able to get it, because the book is going to be released on Wednesday. So, just some few words on yeah, it's true, actually. So, Joseph, you've served as a chief economist at the World Bank. You've been one of the very key advisors of President Bill Clinton. You've indeed won the Nobel Prize in Economics. You've written several bestsellers. I will say in French, La grande désillusion, quand le capitalisme perd la tête, le triomphe de la cupidité, le prix de l'inégalité qui était aussi au lien qui libère. Today you're also a university professor at Columbia and several other universities, and you keep advising the world leaders at the World Economic Forum, for example, among others probably. And now you're publishing The Great Divide, La Grande Fracture, into which you directly, very strongly denounce the mismanagement of economy, the mismanagement of globalization, the irresponsible financial deregulation and tax cuts, the cupidity of bank leaders, of rent seekers. You also denounce the corruption of political process. And you give a very concrete and quite impressive, actually, picture of the impact of all that decisions, impact on the people, impact on the democracy as well, and on also the loss of moral and political authority. You provide us in that book, which is actually this book is a collection of articles which have been published by Professor Stiglitz into different magazines such as Vanity Fair or Harper's Magazine Project Syndicate, and it gives a real good, unfortunately, overview of the systemic dynamic, I would say, that has led to such inequalities in our world today. You also provide solutions, or actually you state that these inequalities have alternatives, because this great divide is not a sign of the great divine. It's very much a man-made situation. It's very much a choice. So that's what we are going to be speaking tonight together. Please welcome Mr. Stiglitz. So, I must tell you that I think it's the very first time that I read a book written by an American economist, and I feel not that bad being French. To be honest, I almost felt like the American myth is France at the moment. I mean, we have our stuff to deal with as well. But my very first question is, when reading this book, has the American dream become an unreachable myth because of those last 30, 35 years?
Yeah, I'm afraid very much so. One of the essential aspects of our conception of ourselves and others' conception of us is that we are a country of equal opportunity. And we all know examples of people who've made it from the bottom to the top, and the fact is they're so unusual they get written up in the newspaper. The newspaper doesn't write about things that happen all the time. They only write about things that are unusual, and they're really unusual. So when an economist or social scientist says that there's a lot of inequality, there's not equality of opportunity, what they mean is, what are the life chances? What are the statistics? And in those terms, the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other advanced country, including old Europe, like France.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, you indeed give a very, very, as I said, concrete picture of what I would say most American citizens are facing today. Can you give us some few words on that? Because last week, actually, some data have been released by the government saying that the GDP is going back and it's not that bad in the United States and so on. So it's also a little bit our vision, in a way, I would say. So what, I would say, key fact or significant inequalities, could you maybe explain to us so we understand what you are denouncing?
Yeah, so I was just at Jackson Hole, which is where all the central bankers were meeting, and a discussion about the recovery. And I was with, this is related to the first person who introduced, I was with a group of more than 100 people from all over the country called Fed Up. And they had come to Jackson Hole to explain to the Fed that this recovery is a myth. And they were aware, we don't have as much right to demonstrate as you do in France. So even though we have what we call the First Amendment and all that, and even though the conference was being held in a national park, they were not allowed to demonstrate. So they came, but they wore T-shirts. And on the T-shirts, they said things like, "Whose recovery?" And they had graphs on the T-shirts showing what was happening to our economy. Just to give you a couple pictures, a couple of statistics. In the first 3 years of the recovery, 2009 to 2012, this is the official recovery, 91% of all the growth went to the top 1%, which meant that 99% thought that it was a different economy. They didn't know about the recovery. Another sort of very gripping statistic is that while productivity of American workers has grown actually very significantly, more than doubled in the last 35 years.
But wages didn't follow.
Wages have stagnated. And the rate of growth of wages adjusted for inflation is actually worse in the last quarter than it was in the last 15 years. So things are not getting better. So what they were there, and what was also very interesting about this group was they were Hispanic American, African American, a lot of women, and all the people, of course, coming to the conference, or not all of them, but most of them were white.
It shows, actually, it means, I mean, it tells a lot also.
What?
It tells a lot that all of the people are white.
And they were trying
male, 60?
Yeah,
no?
Exactly. So they weren't young. And so this group of 100 protesters were saying, we want you to know what is really happening to the economy. And the GDP statistic isn't telling you what is happening. One more statistic that gives you, a lot of people in France talk about the success of the American economy. The fact is that incomes adjusted for inflation today in the United States are lower than they were a quarter a century ago. So there's been a quarter century of stagnation. And at the bottom, the minimum wage is as low as it was 50 years ago. So a half century of stagnation. So, to me, when I see an economy that is failing to deliver for the vast majority of its citizens, that's a failed economy.
Yeah, and as you also describe into the Great Divide, it also has an impact on the sense of community of the people and the perspective and hope for the youth people, the children. I was reading, maybe I just want to make sure I get it correctly, but that 1 child out of 5, roughly, in the US is living in poverty today, which is obviously not always the vision that we have of the States.
No, absolutely. 1 out of 5 children are growing up in poverty, which means in the United States, unlike France, they do not have access to health care. They are suffering from malnutrition. They don't have adequate food. And one of the things that has gotten worse in the United States over the last 30 years is that we have more economic segregation, which means that we've improved in racial segregation, but economic segregation means that rich people live with rich people and poor people live with poor people. And because we have an education system that's very local, and like, you worry here about having too much of a national education. We have too much of a local education system. So if you live in a poor community, you have poor schools, and your education prospects are very, very limited.
So you state that these slow growth inequalities are not a sign of the divine, but very much a man-made situation. So whose choice is it?
Well,
there is an article which is "Who Killed America?"
Yeah, I know.
That's the same question.
So that essay was sort of an anatomy of a murder. Trying to analyze who killed the American economy in 2008. And your question is very much,
whose choice?
Whose choice? And the fact is that it's a result of our political process. That a third of a century ago, we began an experiment. It was called supply-side economics. So we used to study economics, and the idea was that lower the top tax rates, free up the economy, deregulate. And the theory was that, yes, this would lead to more inequality, but the economy would grow faster, so much faster that even the people in the middle and the bottom would get a bigger piece of cake. Pie. They would have a smaller share, but a bigger piece. Well, they were right about one thing. It did lead to more inequality and a massive increase in inequality, but the economy actually slowed down. The economy in the decades after World War II was the fastest rate of growth that we've ever had, and it was a period of shared prosperity. So every group grew, but the bottom was growing faster than the top. Now, the only group that is seeing an increase in their income is the top.
Is the 1%.
Is the one? Well, actually, a little more growth in the top 10%, but the bulk of the growth has gone all to the top.
And you also actually explain, and probably if you can give some few words, then we will be talking about the alternative and the positive, maybe, alternative that you would propose. But also, you really perfectly describe the relationship between this political decision and also, I would say, the corporate monopoly, and also the financial excess with the economy globally. And how all this has turned up to, yes, money and investment, but unproductive, not that productive investment, and also lots of also despair within people. 14 million people out of their home between 2007 and 2013. So can you just give some few words on this systemic dynamic?
Yeah, very, very much. So the basic idea here is that markets don't exist in a vacuum. That markets are shaped, structured by rules and regulations, government programs. And what happened beginning in around 1980, that we began to rewrite the rules that had the effect of giving more scope for monopoly and less protection for workers, weakening unions, and weakening workers' bargaining power by the way we structured globalization. And a whole set of changes in corporate governance that gave more power to the CEOs. Many of you aspire to be a CEO, and America is a good place
and we've become
in the United. But it's very inconsistent with the view that you were expressing, and I don't want. I shouldn't mention this because you will aspire to this, but 30 years ago, the CEO pay was roughly 20 to 30 times that of the average workers. Now the average CEO pay is 300 times the average workers, and there are many corporations where it's 1,000 times. And so when you have CEO getting, not only the CEO, but the whole management getting such a large fraction, there's less money to invest and less money to pay workers. So the inequality at the top, the flip side of that is not only inequality at the bottom and a weakening of the middle class, but it's also that there's less investment. And part of the thing that we emphasize, that we're emphasizing, we've rewritten the rules of the game. There used to be a notion of stakeholder capitalism. In Europe, there's much more of a stakeholder capitalism. That is, we were talking about that. A firm is responsible for all the people, not only the shareholders, but the workers, the communities in which they work. But beginning influence of Milton Friedman, they said the only person you care about was the shareholder, and was really, the result of that was short-term thinking. And so short-termism is become a real problem, and the consequence of short-termism is that there is very little long-term investment. And what you need for long-term growth is long-term investments,
Education,
education, in your workers.
IT.
Exactly. And so one of the consequences now is every time the downturn happens, they just fire
their people.
So there's no loyalty, which means that if a worker gets an offer at another job, they leave. So actually, this impairs the long-term productivity. Interestingly, this idea is now being taken up by some of the major presidential candidates on the Democratic side.
I was about to ask, actually, if there is such impact on political decision and new orientation. I mean, a few years ago in the 80s, mainly, as well, and the impact that we see now. I mean, is it realistic to think that some of the candidates, indeed, for the White House, are going to take your vision into account?
Actually, all the Democratic candidates are.
Will it translate into reality? That's my question.
So one of the things that I did, a group of us did, is I'm also at the Roosevelt Institute, which we have each of the presidents has a library and a think tank that's trying to advance the idea. So Hoover has a library, and the Hoover Institution that tries to promote depression and conservative economics. And the Roosevelt Institute is trying to promote social justice, eliminate discrimination. So we came out with a report called Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy, an Agenda for Growth and Shared Prosperity.
So where can we read it or get it?
You can download it from the
Roosevelt Institute.
Roosevelt Institute, and it will be out in book form.
Super.
But all the Democratic, it had a very strong response when we presented it in Washington. Very big coverage, very strong support. All the media, Time magazine, all wrote very strongly in support, and the candidates have been shaping their agenda. Like Hillary's talked a lot about not only inequality, but the link between inequality and short-termism, and a set of proposals to increase long-term thinking, proposals related to taxes, proposals related to transparency, and making markets actually work like markets are supposed to.
That's actually my question now, because after those 10 minutes of depression, I would say, and unfortunately reality, but let's say you're in charge. Let's talk about the alternatives, okay? What are the very first 3 or 4 decisions you take?
First, let me say, the extent of inequality that we have in the United States today has been building up over a third of a century, and it's not going to be able to be reversed overnight. There's no magic bullet. It's been a comprehensive assault on the bottom and the middle, and we'll have to reverse that. So I divide it into two categories. One of the things is that we have to reform our tax and expenditure policies. The United States have regressive taxes. People at the top, like...
Pay less taxes than people at the bottom.
Exactly. Warren Buffett pointed out, and he said it was wrong, so I mean it's interesting that he was paying lower taxes than his secretary. Speculators pay lower taxes than university professors or plumbers. And that distorts the economy. Going back to the introduction, when you tax speculation at a low rate, you encourage speculators. And, you know, as I explained to my students, you don't get more land by having land speculation. As far as I know, I've never seen land speculation lead to an increasing supply of land.
Not yet.
Not yet. So this is not a way of growing the economy, but it does create bubbles. And that creates instability, and that's bad both for growth and for inequality. So that's one. The second category is that we have an excessive inequality in market income. And the fact that productivity is going up but workers are not sharing is a manifestation of this kind of inequality. And this is a result of all the rules that I described. And that's where you need a comprehensive agenda to try to restructure the rules, to try...
Within the companies.
Within the company, within our society. So just to give you one example, it's very funny to think of people on the left arguing that being the strongest advocates of making markets work like markets. So it's not that we're saying you shouldn't have markets, but you shouldn't have non-transparent and non-competitive markets. And in so many sectors of the United States, you have lack of transparency and lack of competition. And what that means is you have excessive profits, and that means that you have workers' well-being is hurt. Let me just give you one example, which very strong contrast with France. So France spends 11% of its GDP on health. The United States spends 17% of its GDP on health. And health statistics are much worse for the United States. And health inequalities are very great. Obamacare will improve things, but only a little. So the various poorest people in the poorest states still do not have access to health care. And this goes back to, with 20% of the children growing up in poverty, they do not have access to health care. So if they have
it's not a basic right.
What?
People.
It's
not a basic right for people.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you an interesting anecdote, Sarkozy came to the United States, to Columbia University, and gave a talk when Obamacare was being discussed. And one of the students raised their hand and asked him, what do you think about Obamacare? And he said, well, I don't want to interfere with American politics, but I don't understand America, he said. In France, even the people on the right take access to health care as a basic human right. And it's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which America signed. And he said he just didn't understand this lack of recognition of the access to health care.
Yeah. There are some things to say also about Mr. Sarkozy and so, but I'm not going to get to that. Okay, so actually, let's go on that very few minutes, because that's not also the topics, and in a few minutes it's difficult for you to answer. But as inequality goes global, it's also come to Europe and France as well. You're quite tough also in your book and articles about Europe and how, I think if I quote you, you said that Europe has been built on fundamental contradiction and that without fiscal stringency, Euro will not survive. So here again, it's kind of the same question, you know, what is the key measure that you would take to put Euro back on track and France back to work?
Well,
just in 1 minute.
1 minute. The fundamental problem in Europe is the Euro. You said one word.
Okay.
Good. The Euro might be able to work, but you need a fundamental reform in the structure of the Eurozone, and not the reforms in the individual countries. It's the structure of the Eurozone and the regulations by which it works. You have to have a common banking union quickly that involves not only common supervision but common deposit insurance and common resolution. You need more of a fiscal union. You need Eurobonds. You need to change the European Central Bank from a mandate only to focus on inflation to something like the United States, where we focus on inflation, growth, unemployment, and fiscal and financial stability. So there are many reforms, and the question is, and in particular, with the failed structure and austerity, it's a recipe for stagnation, which is what...
And failure.
And failure, and growing inequality. You know, France was one of the countries that was most successful in fighting the growth inequality that was affecting most countries before the crisis. But with the crisis, inequality is growing. Not a surprise, because of this austerity, and it will get worse if one continues in the current course.
So you say new orientation, not towards austerity.
You need a growth strategy. You need a new orientation and a new reform. And the question is a political question. You know, if you let me run the euro, I could solve it.
Please do. Please do, because anyway, you know, we don't know who really
But they're not going to let me. And that would violate basic democratic principles. But one of the problems of the euro is that it's undermining democracy. Because everywhere in Europe, people are voting for governments that say they want to end austerity, but then the Eurozone, Germany, says, too bad, your elections don't mean anything. You have to follow what we dictate, and we dictate more austerity.
Actually, you're talking about democracy, and what you're saying about Europe is, I would say, we could draw a parallel with America, if I may say, regarding the sense of community, democracy, and my question would be, what, as human citizens, can we do in such context now?
Well, this goes back to the reason I mentioned the story about Jackson Hole is that's an example of a protest that was giving a very strong message.
Yeah.
And, you know, the good news is that the heads of the regional central banks, Janet Yellen, have met with this group. And they're beginning to hear, they may not fully act on it, but at least...
They start to build up.
It's part of their mindset. And Janet Yellen, you know, the chair of the Federal Reserve, gave a very important speech saying that inequality is one of the most important problems facing the United States. Never before did you have a central banker talk about inequality. They would talk about cutting back on Social Security. They would talk about lowering their taxes on the rich. They would talk about lowering wages. But they would never talk about inequality. So it's beginning, at least to have some effect. I mean, I don't want to sound overly optimistic, but there is some effect. To give you another example, in the United States, we have political gridlock. 70% of Americans believe there should be an increase in the minimum wage. And yet, because of the political dysfunction and the power of money in Washington, it's not even being considered by Congress. But meanwhile, grassroots movements all over the country are succeeding in raising the minimum wage. So the major cities, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, have significant increases in the minimum wage. In Seattle, they doubled the minimum wage. So, and these are grassroots movements often with young people,
Yeah.
that have actually begun to change the landscape. One of the interesting things about this presidential election, Bernie Sanders has been drawing the largest crowds. He's getting 20, 30,000 people at each of his speeches, and a lot of these are young people.
So we can raise our voice. It can work.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if it can work, but you can raise your voice.
That's for sure.
Don't raise
We do
your
actually
voice,
in France. We
work.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You will preserve the status quo.
C'est le pari de Pascal. Okay. We're in the business school, actually, and you also talk very much about economic theory and economic academic, big experts, and rating agencies, and all those, I would say, team of people that have contributed significantly and still do to this raising inequality. Can you give some few words to the students and maybe the teachers into this room about the role and the extent that such bad economic, I would say, theory or ideology can impact the life of the people? And maybe talk about the INET.
Sure. Yeah. So before the crisis, the prevalent idea was that markets on their own were efficient and stable. And the idea was that, as I mentioned, the supply side economics, you take away regulations, and markets were self-regulating. And people like Greenspan and Bernanke believed that markets were self-regulating. Now, let me make it clear that there was a very strong theory explaining why that was not true. That, I mean, one of the, I modestly say one of my important papers was to explain why it was that the invisible hand was often invisible. And that was because it wasn't there. And that whenever there were imperfections of information, asymmetries of information, incomplete risk markets, which is always, markets are not necessarily efficient, that Adam Smith got it wrong. You know, and I don't blame him.
Let's say it, I mean,
what?
Let's say it. You know, Adam Smith got it wrong.
You know, he was writing very early, before the modern economy, before innovation, before people worried about, and actually if you read Adam Smith, he understands economics better than those who say that they are followers of Adam Smith. So if you read Adam Smith, he actually talks a lot about the consequences of imperfect information and why it doesn't lead to the,
That's true.
what so many of the people who followed Adam Smith said. So but these ideas about efficient markets had enormous influence in both corporations and in
business school as well.
In business schools and in government and central banks. The models were, you know, what was striking about the failure of the models used by central banks is they didn't have a financial sector. They didn't have any banks. So if the models were correct, the central banks would not actually exist. So it was the ultimate irony that they were using models that, if they were true, the central bankers
would not exist.
But they didn't understand that. So in the aftermath of the crisis, I helped organize something called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and it actually brings out a lot of old ideas, but we're not mainstream, but it's also pushing a lot of new ideas.
And so the students can have a look at it, the INET?
Yeah, you can, again, it's a website, and they give grants. They have a very active student program that when INET had a very big meeting in Paris here in April, they brought several hundred students from all over the world, mostly from Europe, to Paris to listen to these new ideas, because belief very strongly is we have an expression in American, you can't teach an old dog new tricks.
On dit en français, c'est on n'apprend pas au singe à faire la grimace.
Yeah. So the idea is some of the older economists were not going to reform. Our hope is the younger people. And so that's why we're putting a lot of focus in changing education and getting younger people interested in issues like inequality, like the way markets actually work, and also climate change, the environment.
Actually, that's going to be my last two questions, actually, the environment. But before that, about the young people, mainly in this room, the ESCP Europe is very active in the field. Also, lots of students that we see now are emerging, willing to be part of the social business movement, let's say, and using their knowledge in business to make the social activity grow further, bigger, have more impact. What do you think about this so-called social business, I would say, as you see it developing?
Oh, I think it's very, very hopeful, and I think there are some really big successes. You were mentioning that Eunice came here. The microcredit movement in Bangladesh has transformed Bangladesh. And it's not only Grameen Bank, but BRAC. There have been several. There are actually 3 very large microcredit regimes. All of them with a different. They're not for-profit. They're a very different model, and they've been very successful in changing the nature of society. You know, Eunice said very, when he began his work, he said he wanted to have a social revolution through the market, through his lending, and that's why he lent to the poorest of the poor, and he lent to women. And to give you one other example of how they've really changed things. He may not have talked about this, but in Bangladesh they passed it used to be that you could get a divorce with much less complexity than America or France probably. All you had to do is the man would say, "I divorced thee 3 times," and you were divorced. But the woman was left on her own. And what they changed the constitution the constitution in Bangladesh said that that was not okay, but the practice continued. And BRAC, another microcredit, spent a lot of effort on legal education, teaching women their legal rights. But then what Grameen did was really interesting. They had a program of mortgages. And mortgages, this is very hard for people in Paris to understand, but you could get a major mortgage to redo your house for $300. So that can make a very big difference. But they only would give a mortgage if they changed the name of the house into the name of the woman. And now, when the guy says, "I divorced thee 3 times,"
she keeps the house.
She says, "Go away, and I keep the house," and that's changed the power dynamics.
The paradigm. Definitely. I didn't know actually. So my last question, because the time is running, we will be hosting the COP21 in France in December. So I would say, I'm not going to ask you if you're a COP21 optimist, but I'm rather going to ask you, how could the global warming turn into an opportunity for us to change or revise our priorities in terms of economy, political innovation?
Well, this is related to one of the themes that the Commission on Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress that I chaired focused on, that our measure of GDP doesn't take into account the degradation of the environment, global warming, the depletion of natural resources. And a very big message that we had is, if you don't measure the right thing, you will do the wrong thing. So we don't recognize the damage that we're doing to our future. And so one of the important things that this is reminding us is that the direction that we're going is the wrong direction. Now, there's another, I gave a talk in Paris to a very big meeting in July of the scientists at UNESCO. And one of the important points I raised there is that actually adopting an agenda of global warming would strengthen the economy and reduce inequality. The reason for this is that the real problem right now is for the weakness in the global economy is insufficient demand, aggregate demand. But if we priced carbon, if we recognize the importance of the cost of carbon, we would retrofit, we would provide incentives to retrofit our economy to respond to that. So we would have enormous new investment in green investment, and that would stimulate the economy. And one of the, climate change is a major source of global inequality, because the people who are being most affected are those the poorest people in the tropics, and so it's increasing poverty among the poorest. So this is an issue where one of the other examples where you could get stronger economy and less inequality by doing the right thing for the environment.
Yeah. We'll see in December how it's going to go, actually. We will be receiving the 3 students now. They have prepared their questions. So please welcome Stéphanie, Anna and Paul. Je pense que vous pouvez amener vos sièges un peu plus vers nous, les avez extraits tout à l'heure. Okay, so it's impressive, but it's going to be okay. Anna, we're going to start with you. Okay, so they have prepared some questions. We have 15 minutes, and probably we'll try to have a row of 2 questions each one. And first we start with you, Anna, your very first questions.
First, nice to meet you.
Attends.
Nice to meet you, and thanks for coming here. So my first question will be, in your book, you evoke measures like raising taxes for the top 1% and capping the wages for the CEOs of big firms. But in this context of globalization, don't you fear that rich people and entrepreneurs will go abroad and leave their country because they have other opportunities abroad?
Well, this is a situation where the United States is at a little bit of an advantage relative to France and to Europe, but it's an important lesson for reform of Europe. In the United States, we are taxed on our global income, and wherever you live, and wherever you make your money. So if you go abroad, you still have to pay tax. The only way to escape it is to give up your American citizenship. And then we have a very high exit tax. So we tax you if you decide to give up your citizenship. We will make sure that you regret it. But in France and in Europe in general, one of the deficiencies in forming the EU was that you allowed free mobility of labor, but you didn't think about the implications that that had for tax avoidance in a world where you did not have adequate tax harmonization. So one of my recommendations for the Euro, as well as the EU, is one of the ways to make Europe work better is to tax income at the top, wherever you make it, and wherever you live. If you're a European citizen, do exactly what the United States does and have an exit tax. If you want to go to Singapore, you can go to Singapore, but you have to pay the price. And use that for a solidarity fund for countries that are facing a crisis or for the addressing the problems of poverty.
Okay, thank you.
Stephanie, you have a question?
Yes, a few minutes ago you've mentioned the minimum wage. And my first question for you is, do you think a global basic income could help reduce inequality?
Yes, I think a basic income, and that's sort of a level of income no matter what you do, would help. But when I would discuss the fundamental problems in the United States and in most other advanced countries, part of the problem is the before tax and transfer, the distortions in our market economy. So it doesn't solve that problem. And it doesn't solve the distortions in our tax system that lead to somebody like Warren Buffett paying a lower tax than his secretary. So it's a move in the right direction, but it's not a panacea. As I said, there's no silver bullet. It's one of the things that could help.
Thank you.
Paul, you have questions.
Well, first, once again, thank you for being here. That's an honor. My first question will be about inequality in education. You've already mentioned it, but in the last few years we've seen a dramatic increase in university fees, particularly in the United States and also Great Britain, for instance. And some people say that it could be at the core of the next economic earthquake crisis. What is your opinion about that?
Yeah, it is a concern for two reasons. One of them is that tuition is increasing, not because universities want to, but there's been cutback of government support, and the only way, and it's not because professors are paid too much. In fact, we're paid too little. But that's self-serving. But basically, when the government cut back, the only place for the state universities to make up for it was to raise tuition. The consequence is that American middle class, ordinary Americans, are being squeezed. Their incomes are going down, and they have the cost of a basic necessity. And one of the things, if you don't get a college education, incomes have plummeted. You know, I said the median income has stagnated for the last 35 years. But for those who don't have a college education, their incomes have gone down 20%. So they know they need a college education, but their parents can't afford it. So what they've done is to borrow. And student debt now is larger than credit card debt. It's over $1 trillion. And the average student has $30,000 of debt, but that's increasing. And students who study law or other are graduating with a couple $100,000 of debt. And that means that education is becoming less and less accessible. But it's also beginning to have a macroeconomic effect. Two macroeconomic effects. First of all, when they graduate from college, they have such a big debt that they can't choose a profession that they want to do. People who graduate from law school have to go into corporate law. They can't do environmental law or whatever they want to do. Secondly, they can't buy a house. They have to live with their parents or in a small apartment, 2 or 3 people. And so these are people in their 30s, not being able to start a family, and that dampens the economy. And finally, it's actually just recently, an article came out of how it's undermining entrepreneurship, because young people graduating from business school would like normally to start a new business, many of them, but with so much debt, no bank will lend them money. And so unless you have a rich father, I tell my students, the most important decision you can make in your life is choosing the right parent. And if you make the wrong decision, life is very hard, especially in America. And you do a better job in France.
Actually, we have lots of startups and very dynamic young people actually starting companies to get money, actually. Yeah. So. Anna?
So, one solution would be to increase equal opportunities in order to make everyone more lucky to have the careers they want and everything. So if you had a few criteria to judge whether equal opportunities is improving, what would it be? What would they?
Yeah, well, you know, over the long term, we would look at this data about whether the life prospects of a young American are as dependent on the income and education of his parents. That will take a long time. The evidence right now is things are getting worse. The intermediate variable, you know, in the short run, what we can see is access to education. I mean, because that's really the mechanism. And I talked before about how important getting a college degree is to survival in a modern economy. Only about 8 to 9% of people in the bottom half of our income distribution get a college, graduate from college. So, and if you do a chart, you can see on one axis you put parents' income, and the other axis you put the fraction who graduate from college. It's a very close fit. The higher the income, the higher the probability. So in the short run, one of the ways we would be measuring success is if we could get access to education regardless of the parents' income.
Okay, thank you.
Stephanie.
So my second question is, recently in the US, the labor force participation rate have fallen to a 38-year low. So do you relate this trend to the inequality issue?
Yeah, it's obviously, if large fractions of the population are dropping out of the labor force, they're not having income, and that's one of the major sources of inequality. The question is, why is the labor force participation rate so low? And some people in the administration and the Fed have argued that it's because of demographics. The aging of the population means that older people don't participate as much in the labor force. That's nonsense. The central reason is because there are no jobs. They've searched and they searched and they haven't found a job. If there were jobs, they would be in the labor force. And some evidence of this is the labor force participation, even of young people, has dropped to 30, 40-year lows because there are no jobs. And what interesting thing is, because of the increase in poverty, older people over 65 have actually increased their labor force participation because they can't survive on their pensions. So actually they've accepted jobs, very menial jobs, you know, fast food, and they said, you know, I may be an engineer, but I can't get a job. The only job I can get is a McDonald's. And so they've accepted that because they have to survive. But so the point is, this is really a symptom of our economy not working very well, and it's a symptom of this lack of demand that is really so striking.
Well, last question, but not least.
Yes. So you see, the audience is pretty young today, many students, and many of them will be decision makers in a way or another. So some will be entrepreneurs, Some will work in social businesses, lawyers, some will be politicians, and some will work in big companies or in the financial sector, and some will belong to what you call the 1%. So if you had one, I would say, critical message to deliver to this diverse audience, to this new generation of leaders, what would it be?
I guess I would echo a little bit what your dean said at the very beginning, that quite often what happens is you get caught up in daily life and your job is to make money and your job is to do your job, and you don't think about what you are doing. So we were talking about the rating agencies. They thought their job was to get as much business for the rating agency as they could. And in doing that, they actually committed fraud. They used bad models because they thought by giving high ratings, they could get more people to go to their service. This was a case where competition led to a race to the bottom. They forgot the role that the rating agencies play in our society. It's a very important role, but their focus was on the day-to-day job. And a few people raised their hands and said, you shouldn't be doing this. But it's remarkable, you know, as American banks engaged in discriminatory lending, 40 years after we passed a law saying that you cannot discriminate, they charged higher interest rates to African Americans than they did to white people. And their idea was, well, our job is to maximize profits, no matter how. And they should have said, no, there are moral ways of making profits, real innovation, and there are immoral. It is striking, not a single person from Wells Fargo said that was wrong. And they went ahead and did it. And I mentioned one bank, but it's the largest provider of mortgages in the country. So, and these problems of fraud, these problems of discrimination, the banks engaging in manipulating LIBOR. $300 trillion depend on LIBOR. They knew it was wrong, or they should have known, but they were focused on the here and now. How do I make more money for myself and my company?
So you said more consciousness.
More consciousness. That, in two words, that's it. More consciousness, thinking about the values, why they entered, what they...
Their job and why they're doing that. And
what is the social function of finance? What is the social function of each of these activities?
Thank you very much.
So, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, you said you're okay to sign your book for the one who are going to buy it just at the entrance if you want to have a few minutes and few talks with Professor Stiglitz. Thank you very much, actually, for this time, and thank you very much.